In the summer of 1944, somewhere in the pine woods south of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, a group of German prisoners of war began digging into the earth with shovels and wheelbarrows. Tearing open the red clay soil and hauling mud and roots and rocks out of a shallow valley that American engineers had surveyed months earlier, the men working under blazing sun that turned their skin brown and made the sweat run down their faces in rivers. Doing work that would never be celebrated in any war history book yet, that would create something lasting and beautiful that millions of Americans would enjoy for decades, without ever knowing that the hands that shaped the ground beneath their feet belonged to enemy soldiers who had once fought to destroy the nation they now served through labor. The lake they were building becoming one of the most striking examples of how war creates the strangest partnerships between people who have every reason to hate each other. I first heard this story from a man named Harold Whitfield, who grew up in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and spent 80 years walking the same ground where those prisoners worked, told me how his grandfather had been one of the American guards assigned to watch over the work crews, building what was then called Lake Shelby, kept a small leather journal describing the daily routine of supervising enemy soldiers who dug and hauled and leveled earth from morning until the heat became unbearable in afternoon, then resumed work in the cooling shade of late day when the worst of the sun had passed. Harold said his grandfather wrote about the prisoners with a mix of wariness and grudging respect, describing men who were not what propaganda had prepared him to expect, not frothing fanatics, but tired soldiers trying to get through each day and earn their 80 cents and smoke their cigarettes and wonder what was happening back home in Germany, where their families lived under bombs that fell every night. Camp Shelby near Hattiesburg had been one of the most important military installations in the United States since its founding in 1917. Expanded massively for World War II until it encompassed over 300,000 acres of pine forest and red clay hills and training grounds that stretched further than a man could walk in a single day. At its peak during the war years, the camp held as many as 75,000 soldiers at once, making it the second largest military training base in America after Fort Benning in Georgia, a city unto itself, complete with hospitals and churches and movie theaters and bowling alleys nestled among the longleaf pines of southern Mississippi. The kind of place where young men from every corner of America arrived as civilians and left as soldiers ready to fight in Europe or the Pacific. The decision to build a lake a few miles from the main camp had come from Brigadier General George Halloran, who commanded Camp Shelby from 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor until the war ended. A leader described by those who served under him as a man with genuine heart for the welfare of the soldiers in his care. Someone who understood that training for war required not just physical conditioning and weapon skills, but also opportunities for the spirit to rest and recover from the grinding pressure of military life. General Halloran had sponsored recreational projects throughout the war years, understanding that men who were allowed to fish and swim and spend time in nature performed better in the classroom and on the training range than men whose every waking hour was consumed by duty without relief or beauty. The plan for the lake was simple enough on paper: dam a small natural drainage valley to create a body of water large enough for fishing and swimming, and eventually water skiing, using the terrain that already sloped in ways that made the project feasible without enormous engineering effort. But simple plans often become complicated when you try to execute them during wartime when labor is scarce, and resources are stretched thin, and every able-bodied American man of working age is either fighting overseas or working in factories producing the weapons and ammunition that the fighting requires. The Army could not spare engineers and construction workers for a recreational lake when those same men were needed to build bridges and roads and fortifications that would determine whether America won or lost the war. Then something unexpected happened that solved the labor problem in ways nobody had anticipated. Today, welcome to my channel and to an authentic World War II story in which ordinary people were pushed into moments that tested their fear, courage, and humanity. My name is Dr. Franklin Carter. I'm 80 years old, a retired military veteran, and I have been telling war stories for many years. If you are ready to follow me through these stories of war, then kindly like this video, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications so you can see other episodes when they're released. Also, tell me where you are watching from and what exact time you are watching right now. This story is just starting, so sit down and follow me to the end. By late 1943, the United States was receiving hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war captured in North Africa and later in Italy and France, men who needed to be housed and fed and kept productive according to Geneva Convention requirements that also happened to allow their labor to be used for projects that did not directly aid the war effort. Camp Shelby received approximately 2,500 of these prisoners, most of them veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps who had fought fiercely across the deserts of Tunisia and Libya before Allied forces finally trapped and destroyed their armies in the spring of 1943, shipping the survivors across the Atlantic to camps scattered throughout the American South. The Geneva Convention of 1929 allowed prisoners to be required to work as long as the tasks did not contribute to their captors' war production. And building a recreational lake for American soldiers arguably fell into that gray area, providing morale support rather than direct military advantage. Each prisoner who worked outside the compound received 80 cents per day, roughly equivalent to the pay of an American private, money they could spend at the camp canteen on cigarettes and small comforts that made captivity bearable. Most prisoners chose to work because the alternative was sitting in barracks all day with nothing to occupy their minds, and the work, despite being exhausting, gave them purpose and structure and reason to get out of bed each morning. You won't believe what the first weeks of the lake project looked like when work crews arrived at the site. Harold Whitfield's grandfather wrote in his journal that the prisoners stood at the edge of the drainage valley in the early morning light, looking down at the landscape they were supposed to transform, and several of them laughed out loud at the enormity of the task compared to the primitive tools they had been given. No heavy machinery, no bulldozers or excavators that modern construction would demand, just shovels and wheelbarrows and hand tools and human muscle. The same basic implements that men had used to move earth for thousands of years before machines made such labor unnecessary. The Germans had been soldiers fighting in desert campaigns with tanks and artillery and aircraft. Now they were reduced to digging ditches with hand tools in Mississippi mud. The contrast between what they had been and what they had become visible on their faces every morning when they picked up their shovels and began again. The work crews were organized into teams of 20 men each, supervised by German non-commissioned officers who had been soldiers of some rank before capture, and who maintained discipline among their men with the same military precision they had applied during combat operations. Harold's grandfather described watching these sergeants and corporals organize their teams with efficiency that impressed him, assigning men to tasks based on physical strength and skill, rotating heavy work so nobody was destroyed by the labor, keeping pace steady enough to make progress without burning out the workforce in the first week. The German military culture of discipline and teamwork translated seamlessly into construction labor, the same chain of command and mutual responsibility that had made the Afrika Korps dangerous in battle, now making the work crews productive and organized in ways that American labor crews rarely achieved. The physical demands of the work were brutal, even by wartime standards, men digging into clay that hardened in the sun and turned slippery in the rain, hauling wheelbarrows full of earth up slopes that seemed to grow steeper with each trip, working in heat that pressed down on their backs like a physical weight during the long Mississippi summers, when the humidity made breathing itself feel like labor. By midday, the temperature often exceeded 100 degrees, the air so thick with moisture that sweat could not evaporate properly, and bodies overheated faster than they could cool themselves. The guards watching carefully for signs of heat exhaustion, because losing prisoners to preventable illness would create paperwork problems and potential violations of Geneva Convention requirements to provide safe working conditions. Then something happened during the second week of the project that revealed something unexpected about the men who were doing the digging. A prisoner named Karl Brandt, who had been a farmer before being conscripted into the Wehrmacht, noticed that the drainage patterns in the valley were not what the American engineers had assumed, that water flowing into the construction site was coming from directions the survey had missed, which meant the dam they were building would not hold properly when rains came. Rather than staying quiet and letting Americans discover the problem themselves, which would have wasted weeks of work and potentially required starting over, Brandt approached the American engineer in charge and explained what he had observed, drawing diagrams in the dirt with a stick to show how the water table connected to springs further up the hillside that needed to be accounted for in the design. The engineer, a young lieutenant named Thomas Reeves, who had been assigned to the project because nobody else wanted the job of supervising prisoners in Mississippi heat, initially dismissed Brandt's concerns because accepting advice from an enemy soldier felt wrong and potentially embarrassing in front of the other guards. But Thomas was competent enough to check the prisoner's claims, spent an afternoon walking the hillside with a compass and notebook, and discovered that Brandt was exactly right. The spring system would have undermined the dam within months of completion if the drainage had not been redesigned. Thomas thanked Brandt privately that evening, acknowledged the debt without making a public display that might embarrass either man, the small act of gratitude between enemies creating a connection that neither had expected and both would remember for the rest of their lives. The food provided to the prisoners during the lake construction was surprisingly good by any standard, certainly better than what most Mississippi families were eating during the same period when wartime rationing limited civilian access to meat and sugar and other staples that Americans took for granted in peacetime. German cooks at the camp prepared meals from ingredients furnished by the Army. Breakfast might include cereal and toast and jam and coffee with milk and sugar. Lunch could be roast pork with potato salad and carrots. Supper might feature meatloaf with scrambled eggs and fresh bread. The meals intended to keep working men strong enough to perform the physical labor the project demanded. Harold's grandfather wrote that this food situation created resentment among local Mississippians, who could see prisoners eating well while their own families struggled with rationing. The irony that enemy soldiers ate better than American citizens being one of the most painful contradictions of the Geneva Convention system. Some local women who had sent sons overseas to fight and die against these same German armies felt the unfairness most acutely. Watched prisoner work crews eat lunch in the shade of pine trees, while their husbands and brothers ate whatever the army provided in trenches and foxholes across Europe. The comparison making the righteous cause of the war feel somehow tainted by the kindness shown to those who had fought against it. The work progressed through the fall of 1944 as Allied armies pushed deeper into France and Germany, and the war moved toward its inevitable conclusion. The prisoners hearing news through camp radio and through conversations with guards who brought newspapers into the compound, despite regulations against sharing war information. The news was increasingly bad for Germany, Allied forces advancing on multiple fronts, German cities being destroyed by bombing raids that turned entire urban centers to rubble, the Reich shrinking week by week as the armies that had once conquered most of Europe were pushed back toward the homeland they had left to conquer others. Yet the prisoners continued digging, continued building the lake that would never serve any German purpose. The disconnect between the collapsing war and the steady labor creating strange psychological state where men could focus on the immediate task of moving earth and shaping ground, while the larger world they had known fell apart around them. You won't believe what happened when a group of Japanese-American soldiers from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team walked past the prisoner work site one afternoon in late 1943 and saw the Germans digging in the mud. The 442nd had been training at Camp Shelby since April of that year, Japanese Americans who had volunteered to fight for a nation that had simultaneously imprisoned their families in internment camps. Men proving their loyalty to America through military service while their parents and siblings remained behind barbed wire in camps across the West Coast, the bitter irony of their situation known to everyone involved, but rarely discussed openly. The encounter between Japanese-American soldiers and German prisoners created one of the strangest moments in the entire history of Camp Shelby. Two groups of men who had been declared enemies or suspected of enemy sympathies by the same American government standing on opposite sides of a construction site, one group fighting for America despite being treated as threats to national security, the other group working for America despite having recently been trying to destroy it. Harold's grandfather described watching the two groups observe each other with curiosity and confusion, the Japanese Americans having spent months hearing about the brutal enemy they would soon fight in Europe, while the Germans stood there covered in Mississippi mud, looking nothing like the fearsome warriors that propaganda had created in American imaginations. One Japanese-American soldier, named Takeshi Nakamura, who had volunteered from an internment camp in California, walked closer to the work site and watched the Germans for several minutes before a guard told him to move along, the young man's face showing fascination rather than hatred as he observed enemy soldiers doing the same kind of physical labor that his family had performed in California strawberry fields before the war made them prisoners in their own country. Takeshi later told fellow soldiers that he had expected to feel anger when he saw Germans up close, but instead felt something closer to recognition, understanding that these men were trapped by circumstances beyond their control, just as his family had been trapped by racism and wartime hysteria. The shared experience of being reduced to labor and confinement, creating unexpected connection across the lines that war was supposed to make absolute. The 442nd left Camp Shelby in April 1944 for Italy, where they would become the most decorated unit in American military history, fighting with extraordinary courage against the very nation whose prisoners they had watched digging a lake in Mississippi just months earlier. The men of the 442nd earned 21 Medals of Honor and over 4,000 Purple Hearts and 7 Presidential Unit citations, proving their loyalty to America through blood and sacrifice that far exceeded what the nation had any right to expect from citizens it had simultaneously imprisoned. Some of them died in Italian mountains fighting Germans, the same Germans who had continued working on Lake Shelby through those same months. The distance between the lake construction site and the European battlefields measuring not just miles, but the entire moral complexity of how America treated different groups during wartime. The Mississippi River Basin Model Project, happening simultaneously at Camp Clinton near Jackson, revealed just how seriously the Army took prisoner labor as economic resource during the final years of the war. Over 1,500 prisoners worked on that project, using hundreds of wheelbarrows and shovels to clear a 1 square mile area and reshape the landscape into a miniature model of the entire Mississippi River Basin, work valued at several $1 million that would help Army Corps of Engineers predict floods and assess water flow for decades to come. The prisoners who built that model did not receive credit any more than the ones building Lake Shelby received credit, their labor absorbed into American infrastructure without acknowledgement that enemy hands had done the work. The erasure of their contribution reflecting broader pattern of how wartime America handled the uncomfortable reality of benefiting from captive labor while fighting a war supposedly about human freedom and dignity. The timber work that prisoners performed in the pine lands of South Mississippi added another dimension to their wartime contribution. Men cutting and hauling and stacking lumber in forests that stretched for miles through Forest County and Perry County and surrounding areas, where the longleaf pines grew tall and straight and provided raw material for construction projects and paper mills that kept the war effort supplied with the wooden crates and packaging materials that military logistics required in enormous quantities. The timber crews worked in branch camps at Brookhaven and Picayune and Richton and Saucier and Gulfport, smaller facilities with less elaborate security than the main camp. The prisoners living in tents or repurposed buildings while they performed labor that kept Mississippi's forestry industry functioning during years when most local workers were fighting overseas. Harold's grandfather wrote about visiting one of these timber camps in November 1944. accompanying a supply convoy that was delivering food and tools to the prisoners working in the woods, and being struck by the sound of axes and saws echoing through the pine forest in the early morning mist, the rhythmic chopping creating a percussion that seemed to belong to the landscape itself, rather than to men who were strangers to this country. He watched a crew of 12 prisoners bring down a long-leaf pine that was 60 feet tall, the tree falling with a crash that shook the ground and sent birds erupting from the canopy, the men stepping back with practiced ease as the trunk hit the earth, then moving forward immediately to begin the work of limbing and sectioning that would turn the fallen tree into useful lumber. The swastika that someone had dug into the ground in the woods surrounding Camp Shelby became one of the most disturbing discoveries made decades after the war. A 20-foot by 20-foot trench cut into the earth in the shape of the Nazi symbol, reportedly planned as a signal fire that could guide German bombers to the camp if any German aircraft ever flew over Mississippi during the war years. Whether the plan was serious or just fantasy of prisoners fantasizing about rescue, the physical evidence of the trench remained visible in satellite imagery long after the war ended. A scar in the earth that represented the darker currents running beneath the surface of prisoner life, even when the official story emphasized cooperation and productivity and mutual respect between captors and captives. The daily rhythm of life at Camp Shelby for the prisoners followed a pattern that became familiar to both guards and the German men themselves. Reveille at dawn followed by breakfast prepared by German cooks using American-supplied ingredients, then assembly at designated points where work crews were formed and marched under guard to their assigned projects, whether the lake construction or timber cutting or cotton chopping in the Delta branch camps. The evenings brought return to camp, dinner, and the small pleasures that captivity allowed, soccer matches between barracks teams that generated passionate competition, and camp newspapers reporting the results. Musical performances by prisoners who had been given instruments by camp administration as part of the re-education program designed to expose them to American culture and democratic values. The camp newspaper called Mississippi Post, published by prisoners, became one of the most fascinating documents from the entire POW experience. A regular publication that covered camp life and sports and cultural events alongside carefully vetted news about the wider war, the content censored by American authorities before distribution, but still managing to capture the voice and perspective of men living in extraordinary circumstances. Issues from December 1945 survive in the Library of Congress. Christmas editions that reflected the strange holiday celebration of defeated enemies in American camps, the prisoners creating art and writing stories and organizing festivities that would have been entirely normal in any German village, but carried surreal quality when performed by men who were prisoners of war thousands of miles from home. The prisoners also produced a book of illustrations titled Buntes allerlei, meaning colorful miscellany, with a subtitle reading Erinnerung in Mississippi, which translated to Memories of Mississippi. The 44 pages of drawings and comics created by several artists showing life in the camp and recollections of other times and places. The artwork capturing both the daily reality of captivity and the longing for home that pervaded every aspect of prisoner experience. One prisoner whose art was stamped with the camp censorship mark and noted as personal property that could be taken when transferred, created images of the Mississippi landscape that showed genuine appreciation for the beauty of the place despite everything it represented in terms of confinement and defeat. The re-education program that American authorities ran at Camp Shelby and other camps across the country was called the Intellectual Diversion Program, a carefully named effort designed to expose prisoners to democratic values and American culture without appearing to violate Geneva Convention's ban on subjecting prisoners to propaganda. Films were shown regularly, books banned in Nazi Germany were made available in camp libraries. English language classes attracted more students than any other educational offering because prisoners understood that learning the language of their captors improved their daily comfort and potentially their prospects after the war. Soccer remained the most popular sport, games between camp teams drawing crowds of spectators who cheered and argued and debated with the same passion that characterized football rivalries in American small towns. The question of whether the re-education program actually changed prisoners' minds about democracy and capitalism and the values America claimed to represent remained debated by historians decades after the war ended, some arguing that the humane treatment itself was more effective than any film or classroom lesson in demonstrating that democratic societies could treat even enemies with dignity. Others pointing out that prisoners who expressed appreciation for American values might have been performing, rather than genuinely believing, saying what they thought captors wanted to hear, rather than articulating actual convictions. One prisoner named 𝐁𝐿𝐴, who maintained correspondence with 80 fellow prisoners after returning to Germany, reported that no formal re-education had been necessary because they had become what he called convinced Democrats simply through experiencing how Americans treated them. The observation suggesting that actions spoke louder than any program designed to change minds. The cotton fields where prisoners worked in the Mississippi Delta represented perhaps the most emotionally charged labor assignment. Men who had fought as soldiers on European battlefields reduced to chopping weeds from young cotton plants in the spring heat. The work backbreaking and repetitive in ways that combat rarely was, requiring patience rather than courage and endurance rather than skill. The prisoners worked alongside black Mississippi laborers in some cases, the racial dynamics of Jim Crow era creating additional layers of complexity that nobody wanted to examine too closely. German prisoners receiving treatment that was in some ways better than what black Americans received in the same state and same time period. The contradiction between American claims about fighting for freedom and democracy and the reality of segregation and racial violence in Mississippi too painful and embarrassing to acknowledge openly. The 402nd soldiers who had trained at Camp Shelby and witnessed the prisoner work crews before shipping out to Europe carried those memories with them into combat. The image of German prisoners digging in Mississippi mud, sometimes surfacing in their minds during firefights against German soldiers in Italy and France. The strange reminder that enemies could be ordinary men just as Japanese Americans were ordinary Americans who happened to have ancestors from a nation that attacked Pearl Harbor. Several veterans of the 442nd wrote in memoirs published decades later about the Camp Shelby experience and what it taught them about the complexity of war and nationality and human connection. The encounters with German prisoners becoming chapters in larger stories about how Japanese Americans navigated the contradictions of fighting for a country that treated them as suspects. The construction of the lake required not just moving earth, but also building the dam itself, a structure of packed clay and stone and timber that would hold back the water once the valley filled, creating the boundary between dry ground and the body of water that would become the lake's heart. Karl Brandt, who had identified the spring problem, became the unofficial expert on the dam construction, his farming background giving him understanding of how water moved through soil, and how structures could be built to resist that movement. Knowledge he shared freely with American engineers who recognized his expertise and quietly accepted his contributions, despite the awkwardness of relying on an enemy prisoner for critical engineering decisions. Harold's grandfather wrote about watching Brandt work on the dam with the same intensity and care that a craftsman brings to his finest piece of work. The prisoner taking pride in doing the job well regardless of who would benefit from his labor or what flag would fly over the lake when it was completed. The grandfather found this attitude puzzling at first, wondering why an enemy soldier would pour himself into building something that would serve American soldiers and American civilians, but eventually understood that the work itself had meaning independent of the politics surrounding it. That creating something beautiful and useful from raw earth was satisfying on a level that transcended national loyalties and wartime hatreds. Then something unexpected happened in the spring of 1945 that changed the emotional landscape of the entire project. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8th, the war in Europe ending with a totality that left no room for continued resistance or hope of eventual German victory, the news reaching Camp Shelby and the lake construction site simultaneously through official channels that the army made sure every prisoner heard clearly. The reaction among the work crews was not dramatic weeping or despairing collapse, but rather a quiet settling, a collective exhale, as if men who had been holding their breath for years finally allowed themselves to release it. The surrender meaning that their captivity was permanent now, but also that the killing had stopped and their families might survive the remaining months of bombing and fighting. Karl Brandt sat on a rock at the edge of the partially completed lake after the surrender news came through, staring at the water that had begun accumulating in the valley as rains filled the basin they had shaped over months of work, the surface reflecting the pine trees and the Mississippi sky in ways that reminded him of lakes near his hometown in Bavaria, where he had fished as a boy before the war consumed everything. He did not weep or despair but felt something harder to name, a strange peace that came from knowing the fighting was finished, even though nothing else in his life was resolved, even though he did not know whether his family was alive, or his home was standing, or what kind of Germany he would return to. The American guards at the lake site noticed the change in the prisoners after the surrender, the men working with the same discipline but a different quality of attention, as if the urgency that had characterized their labor during the war years had been replaced by something more contemplative, more present in the immediate experience of moving earth and shaping ground. Harold's grandfather wrote that the prisoners seemed to notice things they had not noticed before, the way sunlight hit the water surface in the morning, the sound of birds in the pine trees, the smell of rain on red clay, the small sensory details of daily life that had been overwhelmed by the larger pressures of war and captivity and uncertainty about survival. The lake was completed in the summer of 1945, the dam holding firm against the summer rains that tested it almost immediately after the last stones were placed, the water level rising steadily until the valley was transformed into the body of water that General Halloran had envisioned as source of recreation and renewal for the soldiers who trained at Camp Shelby. The first Americans to swim in it were fresh recruits preparing for potential combat against Japan, which had not yet surrendered, the lake providing exactly the kind of physical and spiritual refreshment that Halloran had wanted to give his men. Cool water in blazing Mississippi heat that washed away the dust and exhaustion of training. None of those swimmers knew that enemy prisoners had dug the ground beneath them, had shaped the earth and built the dam, and created the drainage systems that kept the water clean and contained, had spent months of hard labor transforming a muddy drainage valley into something that brought joy and comfort to American soldiers and their families. The lake bore no marker identifying its builders, no acknowledgement that the hands that made it possible belonged to men who had fought against America before being captured and put to work. The contribution invisible in the way that most labor becomes invisible once the work is finished, and the product exists in the world without explanation of how it came to be. Harold Whitfield grew up swimming in that lake as a boy in the 1950s and 1960s, diving off the dock into water that cooled his overheated body on summer afternoons when Hattiesburg heat made staying indoors unbearable, never knowing until he was much older that German prisoners had built the lake he loved, that enemy soldiers had shaped the ground beneath his feet and created the place where he learned to swim and spent some of the happiest hours of his childhood. When he finally learned the truth from his grandfather's journal, he felt a strange mixture of surprise and something like gratitude, understanding that beauty could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances and that the hands creating it did not have to belong to friends or countrymen to produce something worth cherishing. The lake was renamed Lake 𝐿𝐿𝐺𝐵 at some point after the war, honoring an American military figure rather than keeping the original name that connected it to Camp Shelby and the prisoner labor that created it. The renaming itself a small act of forgetting that reflected broader American tendency to erase the contributions of enemy prisoners from the landscape they had shaped. But the water remained the same water, The ground remained the ground that German hands had moved. The dam remained the structure that Karl Brandt and his fellow prisoners had built with care and skill that deserved recognition regardless of the flag they had fought under when the war was raging. Paul B. Johnson State Park was eventually built around the lake, transforming it from military recreation facility into public park where civilians could fish and swim and camp and enjoy the beauty that had been created during the strangest years in American history when enemy prisoners worked alongside American soldiers to build something peaceful in the middle of the deadliest war the world had ever seen. The park covers 1,500 acres of rolling hills with flowering dogwoods and southern yellow pines and oaks, the landscape shaped by both natural forces and human labor spanning decades. The German contribution buried beneath layers of later development and park improvements that obscured rather than honored the original builders. Then something happened decades after the war that brought unexpected attention to the forgotten story of how the lake was built. In 2023, a retired history teacher named 𝐂𝐮𝐢𝐥𝐿, who spent his free time searching for historical artifacts with a metal detector, found a Nazi war medal buried in the woods of Pearl River County near one of the branch camps where prisoners had worked in the timber industry. The corroded iron cross covered in mud and rust, but unmistakably German military decoration that should not have been in Mississippi soil. The discovery sparked renewed interest in the history of German prisoners in the state, leading to interviews with museum directors and local historians who had spent years studying the camps and their legacy, bringing public attention to stories that had been largely forgotten outside academic circles. Tommy Lofton, director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum at Camp Shelby, explained in interviews that the prisoners had been instrumental to Mississippi's wartime economy, providing labor that kept cotton fields producing and timber mills operating when most able-bodied Mississippi men were fighting overseas, the enemy soldiers becoming essential economic contributors to the state that held them captive. The irony was profound. Mississippi relying on the labor of men it was simultaneously fighting against to keep its agriculture and forestry industries functioning. The dependence on prisoner labor, revealing how completely the war had disrupted normal economic arrangements and forced Americans to find solutions that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Karl Brandt survived the war and returned to Germany in 1946, along with most other prisoners from Camp Shelby. Shipped back to a nation that barely existed anymore, cities flattened and economy destroyed, and population hungry and displaced by the conflict that had consumed the previous 6 years. He returned to Bavaria, where his family had survived through luck and determination, finding his home damaged but standing, and his father and mother alive, though aged beyond their years by wartime hardship and the grief of not knowing whether their son was alive or dead in American captivity. Karl rebuilt his life as farmer, working the same land his family had worked for generations, the physical labor of agriculture, reminding him sometimes of the work he had done building the lake in Mississippi. The similarity between shaping earth for crops and shaping earth for water, making him think of that strange period in his life when he had been both prisoner and builder. Harold Whitfield's grandfather died in 1971, leaving behind the leather journal that would eventually connect his grandson to the story of the lake construction and the men who built it. Harold did not read the journal until 1998, when he was sorting through family belongings after his mother's death, found the small book in a box of his grandfather's possessions, and began reading the careful handwriting that described days of watching prisoners work in Mississippi heat. Small observations about individual men that revealed the humanity behind the enemy label, the guards who were trying to do right by international law while struggling with feelings about protecting men who had been trying to kill Americans months before. The journal entry that moved Harold most deeply was one written in October 1944, describing an evening when the work crews had stopped for the day and the guards were preparing to escort them back to camp. And Karl Brandt, had stood at the edge of the partially filled lake, looking at the sunset reflected in the water, with an expression that Harold's grandfather could only describe as peaceful. The prisoner's face showing something that looked like satisfaction, or even gratitude, for having been given work that created something beautiful. The moment capturing everything strange and contradictory about the relationship between enemies who had been forced by circumstances to build something together. Then something unexpected happened in 2019 that connected the story of the lake to the present in ways nobody had anticipated. A German woman named Helga Brandt, who had been researching her father Karl's wartime service, discovered through military records and letters that he had been held at Camp Shelby and had worked on the construction of a lake in Mississippi. The information filling gaps in family history that Karl himself had never discussed in detail during his lifetime. Helga contacted the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum to learn more about her father's experience. Struck up correspondence with Harold Whitfield, who had been sharing his grandfather's journal entries with museum staff. The two families connected across 75 years, and an ocean, by the simple fact that their grandfathers had stood on opposite sides of a construction site in 1944. Helga and Harold met for the first time in 2021 at Paul B. Johnson State Park, standing together on the shore of the lake that Karl Brandt had helped build and that Harold Whitfield had grown up swimming in. The two of them looking out at the same water that connected their families' histories in ways neither had expected when they were young. Helga cried when she saw the lake, not from sadness, but from a feeling she could not quite explain. Something about seeing the place where her father had spent months of his life doing work that survived him. The physical evidence of his labor still present in the ground, and the water 80 years after his hands had shaped them. Harold thanked Helga for making the trip from Germany, thanked her for helping him understand his grandfather's journal entries about the prisoners, thanked her for showing him that the men his grandfather had guarded were real people with families and histories and grandchildren who carried their memories forward into a world that had moved past the war but never entirely escaped its shadow. The two stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching a family of ducks cross the surface of the water that enemy prisoners had created for American recreation. The scene so ordinary and peaceful that it seemed impossible to believe it had roots in the deadliest conflict in human history. The lake today sits at the center of Paul B. Johnson State Park, a 225-acre body of water stocked with largemouth bass and bluegill and crappie and channel catfish, offering fishing and swimming and water skiing and boating to visitors who come from across Mississippi and beyond to enjoy the beauty of the place without knowing or caring about the history beneath the surface. Children splash in the designated swimming area during summer months. Families camp in the campground, surrounded by pine trees and flowering dogwoods. Fishermen sit on the shore with poles and patience waiting for the fish that swim in water that was held back by a dam built by German prisoners 80 years ago. The peace of the place seeming to have absorbed something from the strange labor that created it. Harold Whitfield visited the park one last time in the spring of 2023, at age 82, walking slowly along the shore with a cane his doctor had insisted he use after a bad fall the previous winter. Stopping at the spot where he had first learned to swim as a boy, when the lake was still new and the world was still recovering from the war that had shaped it. He sat on a bench overlooking the water and thought about his grandfather and Karl Brandt and Thomas Reeves, the young engineer, and all the other men who had been present at this place during those strange months when enemies worked side by side to create something that neither could have created alone. The collaboration forced by circumstance, but producing results that transcended the hatred and fear that war was supposed to make permanent between the people it consumed. The story of Lake Shelby teaches that human beings are capable of creating beauty even in the midst of the ugliest conflicts. That the hands building something lasting and good do not have to belong to friends or allies, or even people who have chosen to help. That work done with care and skill becomes part of the world regardless of the politics and hatreds that surrounded the moment of its creation. Karl Brandt shaped the earth of Mississippi into something that brought joy to millions of Americans who never knew his name, created a place where children learned to swim, and families gathered on summer afternoons, and old men sat watching sunsets reflected in water that his labor had contained and made possible. The contribution invisible but permanent in the way that all genuine work eventually becomes part of the landscape it transforms. Harold Whitfield died in the fall of 2023 at age 83, peacefully in his sleep at home in Hattiesburg, where he had lived his entire life. The obituary mentioning his love of fishing at Paul B. Johnson State Park, but not explaining the deeper connection between the old man and the lake he had visited for nearly 8 decades. His daughter Sarah found her father's copy of the grandfather's journal among his belongings, along with the letters Harold had exchanged with Helga Brandt and photographs from their 2021 meeting at the lakeshore, the collection telling the complete story of how a body of water built by enemy prisoners became the center of her father's life and the bridge connecting 2 families across generations and continents. Sarah donated the papers to the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum, where they joined the growing collection of documents and artifacts telling the story of German prisoners at Camp Shelby. The contribution making the museum's displays richer and more complete, adding the human dimension to what had previously been mostly statistical accounts of prisoner numbers and labor hours and economic output. The museum staff created a special exhibit about the lake construction, including photographs of the work crews and maps showing the progression of the project and the journal entries that Harold's grandfather had written about individual prisoners, giving faces and names to the men who had moved earth and built dams and shaped the ground that millions of Americans would enjoy without knowing the hands that had prepared it. If this story surprised you, if it made you think about things you hadn't considered, then give the video a thumbs up. Share it with somebody. Tell your friends. Tell your family. These stories matter. They're part of who we are. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. I'm committed to researching deeply and also telling you what I witnessed during World War II. And if you've got stories of your own, stories about that war or any other time, write them down. Tell them to somebody. Don't let them disappear. History isn't just what's in books. It's what we remember, what we pass along, what we refuse to let die. The lake remains where it has always been, south of Hattiesburg in the pine woods of Mississippi, where German prisoners once dug and hauled and built during the strangest years in the history of a nation that has always struggled with the gap between its ideals about human dignity and the compromises it makes when war forces choices that no amount of good intention can make entirely right. The water reflects the sky and the trees and the changing seasons with the same indifference that nature shows to all human endeavors, receiving the sunlight and the rain and the weight of time without caring who built the container that holds it, or what wars were fought, or what hatreds existed between the men who shaped the ground. The lake simply being what it is, a quiet place of peace and beauty, created by human hands that reached across the deepest divisions of war and hatred to build something that endured long after those divisions had faded into memory and calm peace.